What's really good, everybody? This is Nathan Allebach, and welcome to the podcast where we get into people's stories and go down a bunch of rabbit holes about what's really good in the world. For today's episode, I spoke with Jennifer C. Martin. Jennifer is the senior editor at Topix and has been featured on publications such as UPROXX, Splinter News, Gawker, and Jezebel. She's even interviewed the most notorious slippery slope figure in Christian culture today, known as Rob Bell, who was the author of books like Love Wins and Velvet Elvis. I actually started to get to know Jennifer through the Steakum Twitter account that I manage, in which we had interacted for months via mostly online humor. But as I started seeing more of her tweets, I realized we actually had a lot in common. We both grew up in charismatic conservative churches and have both since gone through phases of deconstructing our beliefs into something new. So yeah. Throughout this episode, we got to share a bunch of stories together, and Jennifer was extremely candid with her experiences and opinions, so this was just a really great time. Now, without further ado, let's get into what's really good. Jennifer, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's so good to meet Twitter friends almost in real life.
Yes, and I feel like my Twitter verification is BS. Everybody was like, I just can't believe I got verified. But you also had problems with that.
Was it recent?
I think I saw that my friend David Pemberton, who works for somewhere else in San Francisco, got verified. So like last year I was like, oh, he can't be verified and not me. So I just copied a link to my Topix articles and I was like, hopefully this will count as verification. And it did.
That's real life documentation. That's what they want, I guess. Well, not anymore. Now there's no pathway to get verified unless you know somebody. So I think I'm doomed forever. Yeah. Well, that was the whole verify Steakum thing, because like it was right around the time when they had verified Richard Spencer, and then all that backlash came, so they shut the whole department down. So now
seems like a solid plan.
Yeah, except now the people of the world like me, I never get a cool blue check mark unless I pay somebody like hundreds of dollars or something.
Oh wow. Well, my blue check mark it made me respect the whole process less. I'm like, you guys are just giving these away now, but I guess they stopped.
Yeah, it's fine. So for people who don't know, is there any like background or a little bit of your story you want to jump into?
Sure. My name is Jennifer C. Martin. I'm a writer at Topix, and I basically write clickbait all day, and it's super fun, and I don't care. Like, I also write on the side. I write a lot about religion. I grew up in a town called Cleveland, Tennessee, which is the headquarters for the charismatic Pentecostal denomination Church of God. Especially my mom's side of the family is heavily involved in the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee. My grandfather taught at Lee University, the Church of God college there, and also where I graduated from and where most of my family has graduated from, Lee University. It was just like really like Pentecostal like upbringing, and I don't know, I didn't realize how different my upbringing was until my dad started getting jobs and moving around when I was in middle school. And then I would like be introduced, like I met a Catholic for the first time at age 11. And I was like, oh my gosh. And then much less like Jehovah's Witness, Mormons. Like, I don't even think I realized that other people weren't like in Cleveland, Tennessee. It's like, oh, if you're not Church of God, you're Baptist or something. Yeah, like that was it. That's the religious diversity of that town. Wow. So now
No, go ahead.
So, and then I went to college and I was pretty conservative and I was always a little bit of a rebel, but like I started getting really uncomfortable with a lot of aspects of modern conservative evangelical Christianity. And I really wanted to stick with evangelicalism because like, honestly, like I love my liturgical church now, but it's like charismatic churches are fucking fun.
Oh, yeah.
Am I allowed to cuss?
Yeah,
They're so fun.
Yeah.
They're so fun. But they're also like my denomination. It's 2018. They're not even letting women be pastors yet, much less like gay people. So I can't be there. I cannot be in that mindset. Like it was very toxic, even though I have some fond memories.
Yeah, it's weird how, like, I think from the outside looking in, for those who don't really have a background or a concept for Pentecostalism and the charismatic church, it seems like it's a very niche kind of like small group, but it is actually really big, especially in the South and in some pockets of the country. Like I forget the numbers, but it consists of
and overseas too.
Yeah, it's all over, and it's this sort of for those who don't know, I mean, traditional. I'm not sure when it started, like traditional Pentecostal denomination
in the early 20th century. Actually, I read a book on it because I'm a nerd. I read a book on the founding of the denomination I'm no longer part of because I just wanted to know about it.
Well, you got to tear into your roots.
It got started like country Methodist or Baptist churches, and then they like. Supposedly the thing goes is they had like a spirit of God and they they started like speaking in tongues and stuff. And then they just like incorporated that into church services. It started a denomination and it's
like very focused on like miracles and the spirit moving and speaking in tongues.
Oh, yeah.
All these gifts that were in part of the New Testament that for hundreds of years were sort of found to be just dormant. And then now this church kind of brought them back to the not the mainstream, but to their mainstream. It was
just Pentecost Sunday at my UCC. Right now I go to United Church of Christ. And so it was Pentecost Sunday. And I still Pentecost Sunday is so different for other denominations. I don't even think we had Pentecost Sunday. It was like every Sunday was Pentecost Sunday.
Yeah, every Sunday people were getting healed and the Lord's showing up.
That's right.
Yeah, so that was super fascinating when I had heard just through Twitter that's how you were raised, since I had been raised in a very similar context. So do you know the church? I mean, you live in like the Virginia area now. There's a church in Charlotte called Morning Star. Do you know Morning Star?
I've heard of them, yeah.
So they're a pretty popular. They're like a neo-charismatic church. Like, so they fall.
What's neo-charismatic? Okay.
Well, it's just like a newer. It literally just means new. So it's just one of the newer branches, I guess, of this. It's sort of like Bethel Church in Reading. They're one of them too.
Oh yeah.
So
oh my gosh, my friend went there, and she was part. This is a real degree you can get at Bethel. She has a degree in supernatural ministry.
Yeah, that's I have friends with that too. It's super common. Yeah, like they're all about equipping the younger generations into dealing like everything for these churches. Everything is for those, again, on the outside. It's all contextual in sort of where the United States fits into the narrative of our world's current placement and then our world's history, where they sort of feel that God is now kind of coming back to life through this particular movement within the U.S., and that they have to equip people to rise up within politics, within pop culture, within all these different domains, so that they can bring the kingdom of heaven to earth. So it's a very it's from the outside. Like, again, it's weird because I mean, I can't speak to your experience. Like, my experience growing up, there was a lot of really, really rock solid, awesome people I grew up with within this movement. They're super sweet, good people. They had good standing in the community, but it is very cultish from the outside looking in. It's very.
I mean, it was hard for me to call it a cult when my entire hometown because it was the headquarters of Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee. Yeah. And I keep saying Cleveland, Tennessee. I've never even been to Cleveland, Ohio. Yeah. So I'm
you have to clarify.
And the whole town was mostly, like, the majority at least was Pentecostal.
Yeah.
So it was almost hard to escape it before you realize, wow, like, other people haven't even heard of this denomination.
Yeah.
And so it was just a real wake-up call to realize that my little community was not not like everybody else's.
Yeah. So walk people through, just like what was it like for you growing up in this? Were you a strong, like, was this instilled in you at a very young age
Very
to
much.
be? So were you a strong personal believer, or was it kind of just like you weren't sure how you felt about it growing up, or were you
Oh,
all in?
I've always had strong beliefs one way or the other. I feel like I just I think I just like immediately like jumped to having strong beliefs on the
Yeah,
other
yeah.
side now. So I was very like into it and very like I really liked my upbringing and I grew up this is probably why I didn't lose my faith completely, but I grew up with family members who were very like theological and like there are a lot of PhDs in my family,
Yeah.
a lot of like pastoral degrees. And so they would just discuss their opinions about things, even if it was against the church. So, like my uncle, I'm sure you've heard the free will Calvinism argument over
Of
and over
course. Yeah,
again.
yeah.
I'd have too. So we were kind of allowed to like ask questions. Like my parents never were like super, super strict. They were religious, they were conservative, but I wouldn't say they were like try to shut me down. But when I would go to church, I would notice that not everybody was like that. Other people were like forced into lifestyle roles. And it just, I
Yeah.
would say probably the hardest part of it was for me. Like I was a really kind of like a bossy, opinionated, even as a kid, like really strong personality kind of girl. And that was definitely discouraged, not
Yeah.
by my parents, but by anybody I've met in church. They would be like, "Oh, you're so loud." I'm like, "I
Yeah.
know."
Yeah, well, the church are like sort of naturally like even a lot of more progressive churches kind of do this. Like it's sort of within the church body, quote unquote, people tend to fall into roles within the church,
Right.
and
Oh, right.
gender roles very easily fit into that narrative where like depending on any given Sunday, it's not uncommon at all in a church for women, not like you had mentioned, not to be allowed in leadership. Like the most prominent position a woman could be in a lot of these cases is like a church deacon, which is
Yeah.
essentially you're a leader, but you're not really a leader. You're sort of
No,
under the
yeah, it's like
counsel of men. So
that's right. Like the men are still in charge, at least in my denomination. And they have a big, what do they call it? Like a big meeting, like every 2 years. What is it? General Assembly. That's what they call it.
okay,
And every 2 years, the same one, should women be pastors? And like every 2 years, they vote against it. And I'm just
yeah,
sitting there. I'm like, this is why I'm not in your church anymore. Well, I
yeah.
mean, this and tons of other reasons that I can't imagine that like gay people ever being allowed in leadership while I'm alive.
Yeah.
So
Well, I think that speaks very specifically to sort of your storyline where you, as you said, you left this denomination to be, sort of you swung the other way where now you're part of
oh
a more
yeah,
progressive denomination. I think that's super common for the people like you who sort of they reach, whether it's a wall they hit or they come to a place in their life where they're making these changes interpersonally, biologically, like neurologically, whatever, and they hit a wall and they come to a place where they realize this isn't either something's not right in the church or they're making a personal change, and it's so
yeah.
difficult to stay in those systems to create change because you are
I
piled
tried.
on by bureaucracy and just hierarchy, and it's so much to go
Oh,
up against.
I'll tell you a story about how I knew I was done with the denomination for good. And this is pretty sad. And I don't even know if I've ever written about it, but I applied to be a missionary to Portugal with like me and Daniel, my husband, and like and my two kids. And I was serious about it. Like I was thinking about like raising money. I was like involved with this. It was some like missionary, like European missionary organization. And I was like learning Portuguese. I was like doing all this other stuff. We had gone to interviews to meet people. We had like sat down with people. And then one day I got a phone call from them and they're like, we understand that this is really what happened. They're like, we understand that you and your husband are, what is it, egalitarian, like not complementarian.
Yep,
And I'm like,
exactly.
yeah. I'm like, yeah, we are because I don't live in the complementarian world. I can't even imagine being in that sort of marriage. And then they were like, is it also true that you support same-sex marriage. And I was like, yeah, that's a political view I have. And they're like, well, we don't think we can accept you into our organization. And it turns out that the pastor that we had told them when we had put him as a recommendation that we shouldn't be considered because of our liberal beliefs.
Wow.
And I was like, this, yeah. And so that was pretty devastating. And then I just had to let that dream go. This was before I was writing full time as a job. And then I fell into writing, and now it's nice. I mean, I'm glad I didn't become a missionary, but I couldn't believe that my personal beliefs were being scrutinized that much.
Yeah, that's so absurd. And again, just to give some context for people listening who may not know these terms, complementarianism is the sort of more traditional, old school ideology within just Western Christianity and evangelicism as a whole, where basically it's the notion that men are the head of the household and that men are the leaders, and it's basically the religious take, the Western religious take on gender roles, like wrapped up, in this sort of stereotype, where then women are the helper, and it sort of takes very ancient archetypes, many of which, as we see cross culturally, like many of which generally apply across genders, but also we see all across the spectrum there's mass exceptions. And I think you're a great example of one too, where you just said it yourself growing up how you've always been more rebellious and rambunctious.
Yeah.
And you don't fit that whatever you want to call it, that stereotype at all. So I think it's fascinating to hear you kind of unravel like your story and all this, and how you went from this complementarian sort of upbringing to now you believe egalitarianism, which is more just equal footing of men and women, and how there's not this like hierarchy of one over the other. And it's weird, I think, for most people to hear, because it seems like such an ancient way of thinking, but it's super prevalent really all over.
Right. I remember, like, I was watching when the 2016 election was still going on, and I remember the media people were like, the Pope had said something bad about Trump.
Yeah.
And somebody was like, why are evangelicals still supporting Trump even when the Pope doesn't decry him? I'm like, I know people who think Catholics are going to hell.
Yeah, that's most evangelicals. Most evangelicals don't like Catholics.
No, they don't like Catholics. And I think people are really out of touch with what those communities are really like.
Yeah.
I really think, especially like if you're online and in your little, I don't know, leftist liberal social media circles, it's easy to like look at the people responding to dumb stuff online, but it's like the nice people who are just nice to you and like minding their own business. Those are the ones who I think are like sneaky, dangerous, like supporting these patriarchal, terrible, in my opinion, terrible systems.
Yeah, and I think that's why.
Right now,
no, go ahead.
Oh, right now I go to church and my pastor is a woman.
That's so cool.
I know other people aren't amazed by that, but I'm like, you guys, my pastor's a woman.
No, it is amazing, and it's very rare. And I think that's kind of why I wanted to touch a little earlier on just sort of your upbringing and how serious you took all this, because I feel that many people, like you're mentioning on the outside, who don't really understand this context, I think a lot of those same people did grow up sort of within a similar community, but either their parents didn't take it very seriously or just they didn't take it very seriously. So then when they came of that teenage-ish age where you start to really develop who you are and your identity, then they were already just detached because they were never enforced into any of these communities in a way where, when you're like, when you're all in a church community, it's such a different, like there's a lot of people who say I was raised Christian, but really all that means is they went to church on Easter Sunday. And
that's right. No, you weren't raised Christian like us. Like where it's every aspect of your life, even when you come home, like my grandparents, like all of my relatives, all of these old church people that my grandma was friends with, they've been in my life for so long, and now I'm watching them like all slowly unfriend me on Facebook. Yeah, well, it's such a disconnect. It's such a disconnect because they're like I was going to ask you that too. I mean, how, like, what is the general sort of
placement of relationship within your family that you've sort of found yourself in? Like, are you close with your parents still? Or are you?
I'm close to my parents because my parents also have kind of like, they moved away from Cleveland, Tennessee, and now my parents live in Nashville. And they're empty nesters, and they're just like, my parents have a more fun life than me. They go to country music concerts, and they go to some cliche, typical like mega church type thing. It's like a neutral. It's like neutral. It's like probably still problematic beliefs at the core, but whatever. They just like to show up and listen to a nice speech while holding coffee. So they think they're just as rebellious as me, I'm sure. But they just like their jobs, and they're more into that these days. My grandma is dead, so the matriarch of our family, like, she died in 2011, and my grandfather is still alive, but he has pretty severe Alzheimer's. Oh. And my uncle still drags him to church, which sucks, but it's a lot of it has died down within my family with the loss of the matriarch, and basically my grandfather, and the fact that none of us live in the Cleveland, Tennessee anymore.
Yeah.
So we all just kind of escaped in our own ways. I guess death is the best escape. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I have such a dark sense of humor. Yeah, but I mean, even though my parents aren't as conservative as the denomination is, I'm not as close to them as I was. And all of my old church friends and stuff, that like they've all unfollowed me, hidden me on Facebook, or just straight like unfriended me. A couple of people have sent me, oh, this is the worst one. A lady that I went on a trip with my grandma sent me a message about how she was really sad to hear me using curse words, and that my grandparents like were proud Republicans growing up, and that the church had really helped raise me, which is true, and that it was really sad to see where I was going. And it was such like it came from such a heartfelt place. You could tell that she's like worried about my soul. And then she unfriended me. Like, yeah, I'm sorry that this happened. I'm like, aren't you? But I'm very active in my own church now. It's just a different church.
Yeah, I think you touched on it perfectly right there, where I think for a lot of people, again, not coming from as strongly of the background that you have or I have, that they look at something like that from the outside and it looks just, oh, like, why would she ever say something like that? But from their perspective, like, when you grow up in it, you really understand, like, they think so much of this is this, like, they are trying to prevent as many people as they can from going to hell, and they're trying to win this sort of political, social, interpersonal war. It's like everything's a battleground.
Oh my gosh.
You know?
Absolutely. I don't think a lot of people understand that.
Yeah.
When they attack evangelicals, and evangelicals, especially with like Palestine and Israel stuff going on. Yeah. Like, no, they don't care about Palestinians because they think it's part of God's plan. It's like a self-fulfilling.
It's the other
doom prophecy.
Yeah. Everything. It's that's a whole thing in and of itself, where there's sort of it's almost like looking at itself in the mirror. Like there's like a both sidism to that, where each side is essentially saying it's all about self-preservation, like for the Israelis, and then you look at the Palestinians, and it's like they are the other, like they are intruding on the promised land. And then there's like the reverse to that, where it's like each side basically feels victimized by what's happening, but America has chosen Israel as the horse that they're backing. So that
was the weirdest thing to me. It was how pro-Israel my denomination was, not because I thought it was strange that they would support, like, I don't know, like God's people against Muslims, because of course they hate Muslims. But like I remember I'm like, you guys think these people and these people and these people are going to hell? Do you think Jews are going to hell?
Yeah.
And they would always dance around that question.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so weird, and it's all tied in with geopolitics.
Yeah.
Because I mean, that's the Fox News narrative. That's the sort of it's all wrapped in together. Like this whole like religion. It's the religion it's called the religious right for a reason. From the time that term was coined. I mean, it really is. It's mixed in with this giant narrative, and really none of like when you start to dice it apart, like you're saying, it doesn't really make a ton of sense because when it's just 1v1 talking theology with like Judaism versus Christianity, there isn't much of an agreement there at all. You know, and especially because typically with Jewish culture, like most Jews are Jews, not that they don't take their faith seriously, but it's way more.
I know what you mean.
It's way more of a heritage.
Cultural.
Exactly,
Yeah.
it's way more cultural, and they're way more easygoing with the faith. Like They make the faith and the sacraments involved in their faith a huge part of their lifestyle. But when it comes down to these like really
that's
specific,
what I want to do.
Yeah, but for evangelicals, when it comes down to every specific policy on a government scale and every single text in the Bible, like you have to have a hardline opinion, and that opinion is the end. Like there's no conversation. Like we have the right opinion. And Jewish culture is the opposite, where everything is sort of left in the tension, and they're open to arguing and sort of working through the.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
I never thought of it like that. Have you ever read articles from Charisma News or Charisma Magazine?
Yeah.
That was big in my church. It was probably the Fox News. Like Fox News is too liberal.
Yep. It's so weird. They have like a weird arbitrary landscape across their feeds and like where they get their news, and to where like someone like you or I would say that's super far right. To them, it's like, oh, that's super far left. It's this weird sliding scale.
I don't know, but because of finding lots of progressive voices, I think honestly it began at my evangelical school. There were lots of different kinds of professors there, and if you were open-minded enough to listen to like the both sides of things they were presenting, then you could welcome it. I knew a lot of people who would go to the same classes, read the same books as me, and get nothing from it. They'd be like, oh, okay, whatever, like back to my hardline, what I was raised with.
Yeah.
And then just reading afterward. Rob Bell was a big part. Rachel Held Evans. Do you know Nadia Bowles-Weber?
I do.
I saw her. She came to a church in Richmond, and I went and saw her speak, and she was really good.
That's super cool. Yeah, I was going to ask, are they people in the circles now that you sort of follow still?
Yeah.
So they're like your people
Oh,
still?
yeah, they're so good. I wish that I could be that kind of Christian writer. I really wish that I could be like the inspiring, like helping people save their faith sort of, but I'm just honestly too raunchy, I guess. I can't be that good all the time like they can.
They still put on a brand. I think that's important to mention, just because I mean I also followed all three of them over the years, just primarily on Twitter, a little bit through the write-ins. Like Rob Bell was same for me, like earlier on. Just from I want to say my sort of journey through this is a lot of bumps and a lot of ups and downs, and Rob was one of the authors, I think maybe 5 years ago now, that sort of, it didn't really rock my world, it just sort of reaffirmed some things I'd already been thinking about and believing, so he's had that effect on me. But since then, I mean, I've kind of come through that way of thinking just a little bit, whereas I kind of, not that it's old to me, but like you and I talked about this a little bit when we were messaging on Twitter before, how so much of that persona is still in a way like a brand of ideology, where I get a little bit bothered just by there's a lot of pat answers with
I agree with you.
know?
I agree with you. I agree with you. That's almost why I I don't want to say I choose not to do it, because honestly, if I could choose to be a well-known Christian writer that inspired people and had thousands and thousands and thousands of fans and like book deals and stuff, that doesn't seem like a bad path to go. But I also I could not maintain that image that I find it really hard to not be myself, and maybe myself is just a little I don't know.
Yeah, you're too transparent for sure, and I'm the same way. I think, and I don't think that's an issue. I think whether or not people like you or they like me, there's a transparency there that I think is really valuable. That people like, and I don't know how much of it is a power dynamic. I don't know how much of it is just getting older, but it seems like for Rob Bell is just a great example of this, because I've read so much of him and listened to every one of his talks, all of his podcasts, whatever, to the point now where I could go back. Like, I don't listen to it on a regular basis, but I could go back and listen to any recent episode and just already know what he's going to say. Like, I already know all the the answers he pulls out, the metaphors he uses, and it's
wow, yeah.
It gets to the point where it's like, and I don't think that in and of itself is a bad thing. I just think it becomes bad when it's like a ingrained pattern where it just really does seem to put up a layer of inauthenticity a little bit.
I will tell you something. I think that being raised in a denomination that seems to value like the authentic like experience of the Holy Spirit and all of that, it kind of rubs up you can fix that, right? Rubs off on you in interesting ways. Like I couldn't ever be like another Rob Bell. I just run my mouth too much.
Yeah, and especially too. I mean, he's the progressive example in this case, but I mean, you see it across like political and religious spectrums, where I think you see a lot of pastors that have mental breakdowns, and he was one of them. He had a mental breakdown at one point, like in his pastoral career. I mean, you see a lot of pastors hit these walls where they have to either go away for a while or they completely rebrand themselves. And in that time,
oh my God,
it's like the facade is coming down, because no matter how you slice it, when they get up in front of people to preach or in front of an audience to talk or they write their books, like they are projecting a persona,
Have you heard of someone named Jonathan Martin? You might not have. He's from North Carolina, and he was pastor of I don't know how this happened, but he had a progressive North Carolina Pentecostal church, still loosely associated with the Church of God, and it was he was getting really like well known for a while, and then he had like an affair, and and so he lost his wife, he lost his leadership at the church, and he did like this crazy journey like away from his faith, and now I think he's been like a single dude for like 5 years, just like preaching and tweeting and talking about his failures. And I kind of dig that little authenticity, but I guess you do have to kind of go through some sort of horrific experience in order to like lose yourself.
Yeah,
does that make sense?
That's a totally absolutely. I can relate to that in my own personal life story, whatever you want to call it. You definitely have to face like that level of losing it all, or at least an extreme tragedy to kind of to get to the bottom of it, to face what it is you actually think, because so often you're afraid to even look that monster in the face because you're thinking, wait, do I actually believe there's a hell? Do I actually, like, what do I actually believe beneath all of this cultural and like my family upbringing and just all this baggage that you carry throughout your whole life, and so much of it you didn't choose. Right. Like you just grew up with it.
I know. I think my mom is upset that I don't believe in hell, but like, I remember I told her that I was going to like this liberal church. I'm like, like there's so many, every diversity that you could imagine is in my church. Female pastor, like gay couples, lesbian couples, trans members, poly people, like just like, and then, regular people, tons of regular people. So like any church. All of those people are regular to me. And so then my mom calls me and she's like, Jennifer, does the church you go to believe in Jesus? And I'm like, Mom, the denomination's name is United Church of Christ. And I'm like, I'm sorry, Mom. And so she's always worried about my salvation, I guess, the born again thing. So sorry, Mom.
My parents are too, and I think that's a pretty like we touched on that before. I think it comes from a really good place. It's just I think the most difficult bridge for them to cross in this is that sort of our, whatever you want to call it, the millennial generation. Like, we're the first generation to sort of branch out into this more. Right. See, I don't even want to call it progressive. It's not necessarily that it's progressive. It's just more open, I guess, to different lifestyles and to different just possibilities in general. Because I think there's this sort of, in my opinion at least, to a degree, I think there's this sort of false dichotomy where there's like conservative versus progressive ideologies, and I think it's more so that conservative ideologies ruled for so long in Western culture that it was bound to bottleneck at some point.
Oh, and that's the same for politics too. That I think people don't realize that conservatives, like in Europe, are still, like, basically our country is right, so far right theologically and politically, that I don't think that people realize that we're not that extreme.
Yeah.
Even when you look back on history, there were I'm pretty sure, what was it called? I don't remember. There's a philosophy about not believing in hell. There's a philosophy about
annihilationism.
Yeah, something like that. There was, like, people have always been having different ideas about what Christianity is or what their faith is. And it's just recently, like literally in the 20th century in America, that evangelicalism and the moral majority got such a grip on politics that now to them, Christian has exactly one definition.
Yeah,
and you have to meet it.
Yeah, historically it's been wrestled with a lot more, and now now we have a sort of, like you'd said, it's basically monopolized by right wing Christianity, and now that you're seeing these massive hordes of people like yourself coming out into these newer denominations and these newer ideas. Obviously, that threatens the more conservative communities because it basically signals to them the death of something that they had. But to me, it's like it doesn't really signal the death of conservative theology because it's all on a sliding scale. Like it's weird to think about how, say, whatever you believe now. So you're part of this progressive denomination, and you're, like, comparatively to your parents, you're obviously way more progressive. But if you were to stay the way you think right now and stay that way for the rest of your life, over the course of your life in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, you would eventually become seen as more conservative, because the scales will keep sliding and things will keep perpetuating in that direction. Well, so it's that's what conservative evangelicals are warning us about: slippery slope. I remember hearing, like, oh, if we let women be leaders, then soon we'll have gay people wanting to be leaders. I'm like, yeah, so what? Well, that's why when Rob Bell, he's the sort of archetype of the progressive slippery slope that really opened up a lot of those doors for people to just attempt these new beliefs. Like it really.
I saw Eric I can't pronounce his last name. Metataxis. He's a real. He blocked me on Twitter, by the way. He's a real conservative, but thinks he's really super theological Christian. And he was like, he had seen that. What was it? The Rob Bell book that was like, maybe he doesn't believe in hell.
Yeah, Love Wins.
Was it Love Wins? Yeah. He had read that, and he had just been like, he linked to an article. It was like, Rob Bell uncertain about possibility of hell, and Eric Texas was just like, bye, Rob Bell.
Yeah, that was the John Piper tweet. That was John Piper's famous,
John Piper,
farewell.
Farewell, Rob. Man, John Piper. Gosh, he's one of my least favorites.
Do you follow Stephanie Jury at all? Do you know who she is?
No, tell me.
So Stephanie, she's amazing. She started a platform on Facebook years back. I don't know how many years back, at least 6, 7, maybe more. It's called Stuff Christian Culture Likes. And do you know the page?
I know the site. Yeah.
She's phenomenal, but she created a parody account of John Piper on Twitter, and I think it's called Fake Piper or Fake John Piper.
That will be the first thing I'm doing.
You need to definitely check it out. I don't know how active it is anymore, but it is a phenomenal account. In fact, she did one for Mark Driscoll too. Do you know Mark? He's the worst. And she actually made this, and it's called Fake Driscoll. That's the @ for it. And the church actually contacted her and said, you need to clarify in this tweet bio that this is not the real Mark Driscoll. And she responded essentially saying, it literally says Fake Driscoll in the @ I mean, I don't know how I can make this more clear, but she's phenomenal because she, that page, again, for context for people listening, that page, Stuff Christian Culture Likes, it's essentially a Facebook page where she just posts a lot of just basically what's wrong with Western Christianity, and even if you fall more on the conservative slant in this way, it's a lot of just abuse scandals, pastors going on rampages. Like it's a lot of just watching sort of the cracks erode into Christian culture, and it creates this environment which is really cool for people who are either not sure what they believe, or they feel isolated in their community, or they're transitioning to something, and they can vent and they can sort of deconstruct where they're at on that page. Because a lot of, for most people, depending on where they live in the country, there's most pockets of communities, they're run by churches. So if you grew up in a community like that, and then you don't want to be part of that church anymore, you've lost your community. So for a lot of these people, they don't have a place to go to just talk to people about what they think.
Yeah, that's right. It's pretty tragic to lose your community. I was lucky that I lived in Richmond, and Daniel was. I wrote, this is the Jezebel article I wrote 2-3 years ago about the church. I took a video of Daniel had been this was a summer. Daniel had massive intestinal surgeries to fix them. Yeah, and so he had gotten out and he had a beer and he drank a beer, and so then the church fired him from his position for drinking a beer. But mostly they said it was that, but I know that it was because of his bitch leftist liberal wife. Oh. But in one way, I was glad that we were out of the church, but then we had nobody. Yeah. So
yeah, what do you do?
None of my family lived in Richmond. I just started going to another church, and I'm still there, so worked out.
Yeah, because, it really is. It's so, again, for people on the outside, it's very difficult to grasp, because for a lot of people who live in cities, obviously you're surrounded by opportunity to meet new people and to get involved in the community, because there's constant movement going on. But for most people who live in the suburbs or urban or rural areas in the U.S., there's just not that many places.
No,
anymore,
I can't imagine.
What do you do?
No, I can't imagine. No, I can't imagine. My sister lives back in Cleveland, Tennessee temporarily, and she says it's a lot harder. She's not as left and liberal as me. She's more of moderate. Yeah. But still, she can't stand to be around it, especially in the era of Trump, where she says basically the evangelicals worship him, and it's so hypocritical to what we've been raised with. It's just really hard for her to deal with, and the beliefs they have. And she started going to, those churches that meet in movie theaters.
Yes.
She started going to one of those, but now they've expanded that they're out of the movie theater. And she says she sees people ex-Church of God people come into that church all the time because they cannot stand to be in the Trump Church of God anymore.
Yeah, one thing Trump definitely did is that he took people who generally would have maybe stood somewhere on the more moderate centrist, just that relative, whatever you want to call it, that blob in the middle, and pushed them to one side or the other because of the hard stances people took. His rhetoric just pushed, it literally pulled. It didn't push it pulled it out of people. It really, the kind of stuff he's been saying from the get-go, people either, I don't know how many people, I don't want to say people on the right necessarily as a generalization take to it well. I don't most of the people I've talked to that I know that are really pretty hardline right wing, they don't like a lot of the stuff he says, but
but they vote for him anyway.
It's the party line. It's just it really there's been talk since 2016 about what happened.
Republicans are really, really good at party unity, party loyalty, name brand. Democrats are so bad at it.
Yeah, well, Democrats are more divided. There's way more to be divided over. Whereas the right wing has way more of a centralized tribe, and hence all this talk about fundamentalist Christianity, where there's this drive for them to keep everything together because that is what makes them so strong. Whereas on the left, it is as soon as you hit moderate, everything just diverges into a million streams from there. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's so many not just in church, but politically, socially, everywhere. It's really, it's fascinating for me, like coming from where I live, in a more suburban town. I only have so many people in my direct area that I can talk to about issues like this with a different perspective, I should say. Like a lot of people have the same perspectives, but to get kind of different people's thoughts, and even within a lot of the more liberal, progressive-minded people I know, there's just so much variance on any given point, especially with this church stuff. I mean, there's even when you branch into atheism and agnosticism, people have such strong feelings about everything today, and it really, and it causes so much tribal divide, like on the most things that to me, like I could sit across the room or the Skype call from you, and I could hang out with people and have disagreements and kind of share a space to figure out like what's going on and talk ideas. But for most people, it's just these hard line stances, and they can't find their way around it. And there are some things, I'm not trying to say nothing should have a hard line. Like there's some moral stances that I think are way better off for people to make a strong stance, in the making. But I think just as a general rule, it's so difficult to have conversations with people about anything today. Because one thing triggers them,
And I am one of those people getting triggered. That's something I'm really struggling with in my spiritual boundary, like leftist life, that I have been realizing through going to church, and also like I've been doing some like pretty intensive therapy for my depression and stuff lately. I hold a lot of anger toward my hometown, not necessarily toward my parents, but like toward the family that it encouraged it, and like the environment, and just evangelicals and conservatives in general. I was never that, even as a conservative Christian, I had friends with other beliefs. And now I feel like I find it hard to be friends with people of other beliefs. And that sucks because I don't know. I mean, I don't meet a lot. I don't meet a lot of other people that are like the opposite of me theologically in my daily life here in Richmond. But the anger is not really helping me, and it's making me become the sort of divisive person that I always accuse them of being. Yeah,
but maybe
Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. I'm totally with you. I think maybe though, for where you're at right now, I mean, just the way you described it, how you're going, like you mentioned, you're going through therapy for your depression and what you're going through right now. But I think a lot of what, for me at least, in my time in therapy, a lot of what it comes down to for me is it is almost like PTSD with how you get raised. And I think there's a way... Spiritual
abuse is a real thing.
Yeah. And
I don't know if I would say that I experienced it, but...
No, but I think you did, just not in the context. See, this is where it gets dicey because everybody interprets this lingo differently. But I think there's obviously levels to spiritual abuse because there's physical abuse that can occur within that, and then there's heavy manipulation, and then there's all that. But then underneath that, there's well-intentioned indoctrination, and I think that is still a level of spiritual abuse, because if your parents were loving and awesome, which mine were, and I love my parents, and I love my upbringing, and I wouldn't change, like looking back now, I wouldn't change anything, but that the experiences that I had at that age were still, they still shaped me neurologically in a way that set me up as an adult now to really experience a lot of just anxiety and a lot of falls and a lot of things that honestly wouldn't probably be there had it been shown to me in a different way. And that's not me saying, oh, like my parents were the worst for teaching me this. Like I'm saying, like I'm trying to. It's hard to put this into words because it's not.
You can empathize with your parents and even like the belief systems you have, and still realize that they were problematic.
Yeah, and I think that's the space where more people have to communicate these ideas better, because it really is like when, as an adult, like you have to work through that anger, like you're saying, like you really have to. And for where you're at right now, if you're dealing with that, then it's better to be in a space of people who think like you. It's better to be in your tribe, because anytime someone from the outside would try to come at you with something, it's just gonna, like you said, it's gonna trigger you. And
It does.
it's not going to make you any better at communicating with them. It's just going to make it worse because you're dealing with pain that's underneath all of that. And I think that's super, super critical for people just to recognize that you really have to go through a phase of deconstructing. And for some people, that's a year. Some people, it's 5 years. Some people, it's their whole life. You know, like,
oh, I mean, I was at the point where I was like, oh, I'm a great leftist Christian now. I've got it. I wrote, I did a couple years ago, I did a 40 Days of Lent blog. And I was just super into how cool of a leftist Christian I was. And then I started realizing I was just angry all the time at the other side.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I've lost the good parts of Christianity that I wanted to keep. And I want that. I mean, obviously I'm still striving for that back. And I'm still raising my kids in a hopefully nurturing environment, learning about what I believe and what the church believes, but having, freedom and not necessarily hardline indoctrination,
Right.
stuff like that.
Yeah.
But
do you follow Richard Rohr at all? Do you know who that is?
Is he from Sojourners?
He's written for Sojourners. He runs the Center for Action and Contemplation. I think that's what it's called.
That sounds
based
really
out of
cool.
New Mexico. He's a Franciscan friar, so he's actually Catholic. But he is just he's one of the wise sages in this all this environment that we're talking about. You would love him. You'd absolutely love him.
Oh my gosh.
He did a podcast with, do you know who Pete Holmes is? The comedian.
Yes.
So he did a podcast
Yes.
with Pete Holmes a couple of years ago. It's phenomenal. For anybody listening to any of this, they pick apart, Pete's past, and Richard Rohr sort of walks through and just subtracts.
I had no idea.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. And Richard Rohr, one of my favorite, I don't even know if you want to call it teachings, but kind of points that he's made that's really impacted me is he talks about how in life you go through 3 phases that can be cyclical in a lot of ways, where you go through construction, and then you go through deconstruction, and then you go through reconstruction. And the first part of your life, when you're growing up, you're constructing who you are and your ego identity, and your family is raising you and nurturing you, and you don't have much of a say in anything, but you're just learning and taking everything in. And then at some point, usually when you're a teenager, in some cases a young adult, you have to go through a deconstructing phase where you pick apart the pieces that you don't like about what you were raised with, and the things that you aren't sure about, and the things that you want to challenge more. And you go through that phase. And that's what I was kind of getting at. For some people, that's a year. For some people, it's a decade. Who really knows? But eventually, I think, in his words, the goal is that you want to work through that deconstruction so that you can come out the other side into reconstruction, where you can build a life.
That's where I want to be.
Like what you're saying, with how you raise your kids. Yeah, you want to come out the other side in a way where you're not just like the way you were raised, just the opposite.
Yes.
I think that's what you're saying. It's so easy to take an extreme. When you're raised with an extreme, it's so easy to take that extreme and just run with it
on the other side.
Other way.
On the other side, yeah. I'm just trying to be careful. I don't want them to have a bad experience with the church, but I would like to be reconstructing my own faith more instead of still being in the deconstruction phase.
Well, it's hard.
It's
hard because it's super easy to deconstruct. We all do it. I love doing it too. I think for people like you and I, the kind of lifestyle we had growing up, it's easy to stay in that place because it's what's comfortable, and it is like therapy. Whenever you deconstruct something, it's like therapy because you're piecing apart these pieces of you, that you were struggling with or hurt by growing up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what do you, I don't know, how much you want to get into this, but, where are you at now? Your beliefs. What do you believe, and what are you sort of living within now?
I described this the other day because I got a really long email. I had written, this is for my other job that I don't say I don't take my job seriously, but I suppose I don't take the content seriously. So I had just written an article, historical figures that might not have existed, and I have to get to 60 slides per so I included Jesus. I obviously believe Jesus existed, but I included, I was like, some atheist scholars believe there was not even a Jesus, and this guy wrote me a 10-paragraph email on why Jesus existed, and I had to be like, hey, actually, guess what? I believe you. And so I think I'm pretty postmodern with how I read the Bible. Especially like my grandfather, I'd say he was a professor at the Christian college, but I didn't say what of. He taught creation science.
Ooh, was he a young earther?
Oh yeah, 100%. Every young earth belief, that the flood, all of it. He was hardcore. And so, I mean, that's another thing I had to deconstruct. To this day, I don't know. There's sometimes people will say things about evolution. They'll be like, okay, yeah, I think I don't know if I know what you're talking about. But because even in Southern public schools, they like barely touch on it.
Yeah.
Like bare minimum to like meet legality. And so, yeah, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
No, you're fine. Yeah, I think it's super fascinating to go through
And
where you're at, like where after all of this, you know?
And so now I'm postmodern. I think I'm into liberation theology.
Okay.
Where I think that the Bible is meant to liberate people from their trappings of their lives, whether it's sin or oppression or whatever. I believe in the resurrection. I don't know if I believe in hell. Pretty sure I don't. No, I'm going to say I don't believe in hell.
Yeah.
I'm always thinking about it. It's different. Some days I wake up and I'm like, there's no God. And then some days I wake up and I'm like, the Virgin Mary, God, all of that. I really want, I look at the historicity of Jesus, and I think there's a lot there. And I definitely think he was God. So that's where I am right now. I believe in the Trinity, triune God. But to me, the beliefs of what Jesus was or what anything in the Bible, whether it was all true or false, is not as important to me as the message.
Yeah.
The message is way more important to me.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, when they take all those points that you just made, whether it's the creation story or the birth of Jesus, or these are things that, for most Christians, even though by definition they technically abide by faith, it's most Christians more so abide by certainty. Where if faith is like, I like to look at it, whereas if faith is a scale from 1 to 10, most Christians classify themselves at 10 all the time. You know what I mean? Like they don't really like
That's crazy.
I know a lot of Christians who will make comments about like they doubt, quote unquote, you know, they're doubting their faith, they're doubting. But I think really what they mean by doubt is that they're just going through a hard time. You know, because anytime you go through a hard time, you sort of reconsider everything. You know, if you're going through a breakup or a death in the family, you just get existential naturally. And I think that is a lot different than someone who's living day to day, sort of wrestling with the theological implications of each one of those things that you mentioned. Because for me, like there's some, if it's a scale of 1 to 10, there's some days I wake up and I'm at a 0. You know, there's some days I wake up and I'm maybe at a 4, maybe a 5. But like with each one of those things, I mean, it's really interesting to hear like sort of what parts of it you've held on to and you're still sort of working your value system around. You know, like
for sure.
To go through all of that and to still maintain the sort of whatever you want to call it, the New Testament value of the life of Jesus it's really interesting to hear. Like, cause like I think for a lot of people, would have started listening to this podcast and maybe turned it off after the first 15 minutes because they were frustrated. Like this girl is super left wing and pissed off, and she like you know she's just anti-religion. But then you get to a part of the podcast like this where it's sort of coming back around, and you are like those are pretty conservative positions on a lot of people's scales, you know? Yeah, because I mean, for me personally, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but there's this theologian who lives literally the next town over from me. His name's Pete Enns, and he.
I know Pete Enns.
Oh, do you know Pete?
I don't know him, but I follow him from afar.
Yeah, his work's been blowing up the past couple years since he wrote that book, The Bible Tells Me So. And he's another one of these characters sort of along the way that I've really enjoyed their work sort of post my Rob Bell phase, because the way
Rob Bell is the gateway drug.
Yeah, exactly. He's the gateway. Totally. He's the initiator of the slippery slope, and then you fall down into sin everywhere from there on out.
That's right.
But like with Pete, I really like the way Pete, specifically in his book, The Bible Tells Me So, how he goes through he specializes in the Old Testament just with his own theology, but how he goes through the Old Testament and sort of narrates the story in a way where it gives the reader, if you're reading this and you're in a way more conservative position, you could take from what he's saying and just use it to sort of question all of the bases that you've built your assumptions on about the Old Testament, which is cool. Or if you're someone like me who is sort of already out of that mindset, in fact, I would have at the time been way more atheist or agnostic when I picked that book up, and I was able to walk through what he wrote, and it kind of pulled me back that way a little bit, because I read a lot of what he was writing and said, this to me, what Pete Enns is to me theologically is sort of the missing piece that I think a lot of atheists really could use in more of their public debates. I mean, especially when you look at I can't
watch them.
Yeah,
I get too angry at the atheists, and then I get, especially if it's like a creationist, then I'm just angry at everybody.
Exactly.
So, all of you are wrong.
The players in that game, they really do only cater to specific. And I know Sam Harris is one of the most prominent ones, and I know. Sam, he was I was gonna say he's talked about in a lot of his debates how he's debated Jewish scholars, and at the end of the debates, when he's talked to the Jewish scholars about like how it went and all that, they've basically just said, I don't believe in God or any of that stuff. I'm just here to debate the cultural context. So I think so I think there's a lot of I don't want to call them straw men, but there's a lot of these circumstances that come up in public debate between the atheist community and the faith community, where I think a guy like Pete Enns is a great missing puzzle piece, because he takes what the Bible says and puts it in a more historical context, puts it in a more metaphorical framework where it doesn't need to be so literal all the time. And I think that's where a lot of people get lost. People get lost when you basically say that Adam and Eve were real, and that we've all been derived from Adam and Eve, and there was a talking snake, and that God literally commanded his people to murder thousands of the enemies, and there's all these really problematic parts of the Old Testament specifically. But if you're a Christian and you take it all literally, that's a huge, and most Christians do, so that's a huge problem. But I think a guy like Enns comes in and sort of he creates a new corner of that market, if you want to call it that.
I know. I've said on Twitter, and I've said it again, that new atheists and conservative evangelicals have one thing in common, and it's biblical illiteracy. I think that people don't understand how the Bible was written, or what the context is, or what it meant to the Jewish people. They don't know any of it.
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest hurdle, I think, for the atheist community is that they're less concerned in the work that they do in the public square. I think they're less concerned about maybe the exact theological implications, and more so about how society is utilizing those implications, because they're looking at, it's still somewhere in the ballpark of 50% of U.S. evangelicals believe the earth is 6,000 years old. So people like you and I, we can sit here all day and bat back and forth about, how that's crazy, and we don't believe that anymore. But there is a majority of Christians still in Western culture who believe these.
That's right. I used to believe it.
Yeah, so I think that's more their focus. But I still think now, as society does progress in the direction it's going, more and more, I think they need, if the atheist community wants to survive in the sort of standing that it's in, they need to start taking those theological nuances way more seriously, for sure.
Yeah, they don't. I have an atheist friend on Facebook, and every time I say something about evangelical Christians shouldn't do blah blah blah, oh, how can someone do this and call themselves a Christian, which I shouldn't even be writing these things in the first place, because it just makes me angry and upsets me. And he goes, oh, that's a no true Scotsman argument. I'm like, you cannot group all Christians together. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's not a no true Scotsman argument. That's just something dumb that you're saying, because you have to put it together.
Yeah, well, it's all fundamentalism, and I think again, it sort of comes down to this weird terminology of how people define the terms, because atheism as a term that all that means is a lack of belief. So it means they don't believe in a God. Whereas I think most people, in the way that atheists, it's almost like veganism. You know, the way vegan, because the way veganism is framed is that
straight from the steak guy, he is clearly spreading propaganda.
But seriously, I mean, I think veganism, the way it's propagated by the sort of whatever you want to call it, the extremists of veganism, it's propped up in a way where if you're a vegan, you have to be a fundamentalist vegan, and you have to be super vocal and anti everybody that eats meat, and et cetera, et cetera. It's the same thing with the atheist community, where I think it's sort of expected just by definition that atheism means you're a militant atheist, like you're a new atheist, that you believe religion must be annihilated. Whereas if we're talking in like the specifics of the terms, I mean, faith, the opposite of faith is just non-faith. So that would be atheism. But I think most people classify themselves in that agnostic area, whereas agnostic in the way it's defined is basically like I don't know what I believe. That's basically atheism. You know what I mean? Because atheism is just a lack of belief. So it really comes down to this weird like word game that we're all playing because we're just playing it by the most extreme players of each team. And it's super annoying to me because I have friends in all these communities, and I always want to sort of do them, like I want to prop them up by their best. I don't want to prop them up by the sort of, you know, like the Richard Dawkins of atheism. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like I want to give it its due and its day in court without having to create like a straw man, ridiculous portrayal, you know, and it's just so easy to do that wherever you fall.
Exactly. All right. So do you have a wrap up or no,
time to get to bed?
I'm so old.
No, you're fine. You've been great. This has been awesome. I really appreciate all the time. Yeah, like, well, if you want to let people know what you got going on now, like what stuff you're doing with writing, or if there's a place they can find you on Twitter.
Okay, well, you can follow me on Twitter if you want. It's not a good idea, but it's at not really JCM. I don't know where I got that from. It was because Jennifer C. Martin is owned by a bot on Twitter.
It happens to everybody.
I know. And right now I am doing a lot of fiction writing at home. Like I've been writing a play. I pitched an article in Christianity Today about the one conservative member of my liberal church. And I would love to write an article about that, but I haven't heard from them.
Oh, so, that sounds awesome too.
I know, somebody should let me write it. Really write. Like I've honestly been to do extra writing. I've just been concentrating on my job mostly. But if you want to read some really smart people clickbait, go to Topix.com.
Smart people clickbait. There you have it.
That's right. That's right.
Yo, thank you so much for the talk, Jennifer. That was a lot of fun.
Thank you. You were a lot of fun. Make sure that when you hang out with your friends from Me Without You, that I am a super fan and I want to meet them.
We're not friends. I just played a show with the guy one time.
That's more than I've ever done.
Just keep hitting them up on Twitter. They'll probably get back to you eventually.
Okay. All right.
Awesome. Have a great night, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Yep.
You too.
See ya.
Bye.